Tonight, a face-to-face confrontation on the subject of nuclear energy. Are nuclear power plants dangerous? Or is nuclear energy the answer to the present power crisis? Does the kind of leakage revealed today at the Pickering plant pose a threat? Or is the so-called danger simply a myth blown out of proportion? On this program, the father of the H-bomb, Dr. Edward Teller, opposes the former editor of Survival magazine, Dr. Gordon Edwards. From the Yorkville Studio Theater in downtown Toronto on The Great Debate. Resolve that nuclear power plants are necessary and should be constructed. Your chairman, Pierre Berton.
Once again, we're in the studio. Let's find out how our audience feels about this. You think the nuclear plants are necessary and should be constructed, sir?
I'm not expert on that, but I would think perhaps it would apply more in the aye as regards the United States and more nay here in Canada due to the fact that we have so many water resources in the north.
So you're with Dr. Teller as far as the Americans are concerned, but not necessarily as far as the Canadians are concerned. What do you think, sir?
Well, I think that it's necessary, especially with the fuel shortage and that kind of thing. I think it's very necessary to have nuclear plants for peaceful purposes.
With the fuel shortage, it's necessary. What do you think, madam? Do you think nuclear power plants should be built, or do you agree with Dr. Edwards they should be abolished, not built at all?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm here tonight to learn about it. This is the thing. I haven't really got an opinion at this point in time.
Fine. That's the purpose of a debate, is to have people make up their minds or change their minds. And that's what we're going to do tonight with Dr. Teller and Dr. Edwards. So we're going to find out exactly where our audience stands at the beginning of the program and then find out if they have changed their minds as a result of what they hear at the end of the program. So I'm going to ask the audience now to show us where they stand. If they agree that nuclear power plants should be built, then I want them to hold up their cards with the green facing out. If they believe that nuclear power plants should not be built, then hold up your cards with the red side facing out. We will count the cards, let you know what the result is now, and see if any minds have been changed at the end of the program. Cards up, everybody. We'll be back in a moment with the results.
The Great Debate. Tonight's resolution that nuclear power plants are necessary and should be constructed. And here's your chairman, Pierre Berton. For the affirmative, the Dean of American Nuclear Physicists, Dr. Edward Teller, who says nuclear reactors are necessary and should be constructed. And for the negative, the Canadian mathematician, Dr. Gordon Edwards, who says nuclear power plants are dangerous, undesirable, and should be abolished. Your chairman, Pierre Berton.
Let me tell you where the audience stands. Dr. Teller, you have, oddly enough, the hardest job tonight because the audience is with you to start with, 76 to 20. So you only have 20 people whose minds can be changed, while Dr. Edwards has 76 on his, against him, who he can change. That's the purpose of the debate. Gentlemen, you know the rules. You each have 6 minutes. Dr. Teller for the affirmative 4, Dr. Edwards for the negative 6, including his rebuttal time, and then 2 more minutes for Dr. Teller for rebuttal. We'll start immediately with a clock for Dr. Edward Teller.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you in Canada. I heard some rumors that I have been introduced in a funny and irrelevant manner. And so I want to introduce myself. I was the chairman of the world's first reactor safeguard committee. That was around 1950. And the committee and myself have urged utmost caution in the building of nuclear reactors. And many of my good friends who wanted to go ahead more rapidly were quite mad at me. I acquired the reputation of a mini nadir. I acknowledge that nadir is bigger. I am not quite sure that he is better. Now, I haven't changed my mind. Nuclear reactors should be safe. But something has happened. First of all, nuclear reactors have operated with no industrial reactor having caused damage to the health of a single individual. A really excellent record. But something else has happened. The world is facing a critical energy shortage. Inflation in almost all countries is merely the first signal of the storm to come. I believe that the troubles can be as great and may well be even greater than the troubles connected with the Great Depression. That depression brought Hitler to the helm of Germany. It was the introduction to the Second World War. We are dealing with an extremely serious problem. And it is not a problem, the energy shortage, that can be solved in one way. It must be solved in several ways. But nuclear energy is one great component. You in Canada are in a fortunate position because you have plenty of energy sources. You are almost as good as the Arabs. We in the United States at present are not quite as fortunate, but we can manage. People in Italy are in great trouble. In England, in trouble.
Dr.
We
Teller.
need this energy.
You'll have more time later on, but it's time for the negative. And Dr. Gordon Edwards, start the clock, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, my honorable opponent, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here tonight to talk to you about a topic which has been of great concern to me ever since I first learned about it about 3 years ago. And it has to do with the extraordinary dangers associated with nuclear power plants, which you will not find in any of the promotional literature that you will read, published by the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited or the United States Atomic Energy Commission. The real issue here, it seems to me, is who should decide. If there is, in fact, danger, who is going to make the decision? Is it going to be made by experts who have convinced themselves that they can solve all the problems, no matter how insurmountable they may seem? Or is it going to be made by the citizens who are supposed to take the risks? Now, I would like to just tell you very briefly what those risks are. First of all, it is a fact that every conventional nuclear power plant produces more radioactive garbage in 1 year's operation than 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. This material is extremely deadly, extremely toxic. Nobody denies this. It's scientific fact. This material, there is no way to neutralize it. It must be stored and guarded for 20,000 years at the very minimum. Some estimates, even from advocates of nuclear power plants, run up to 1 million years. Now, 20,000 years is 4 times as long as human civilization has been on the face of the earth. These radioactive wastes will remain dangerous at least that long. Where are they going to be stored? Well, nobody really knows. The problem hasn't been solved, but the technologists are sure that they can solve this problem sooner or later. That's point number one. I might also add, incidentally, that these wastes are so hot they have to be cooled for the first 200 or 300 years by artificial means. Point number 2 has to do with the possibility of accidents, which the people in the nuclear industry don't want to admit is possible. Dr. Edward Teller is perfectly correct in saying that the utmost caution has been used in the building of nuclear power plants. And this is because the people who are engaged in designing these power plants are fully aware of how extremely dangerous they are. In the case of a major accident, which would release, say, 50% of the radioactivity inside this reactor, there could be tens of thousands of people killed and up to $7 billion in property damage, mostly due to radioactive contamination of land, water sources, and food supplies. These figures are taken from an official Atomic Energy Commission report, the Brookhaven report. It is not made up by opponents of nuclear energy. The accident, or I might say catastrophe potential of a nuclear power plant is so great that no nuclear power plant in the United States or Canada is insured against such loss. In the United States, they have partial insurance, only up to $500 million worth. Almost all of that is borne by the taxpayer because the private insurance companies won't touch it. The insurance companies, the private insurance companies will cover up to the first 90 million, period. At that point, they balk. Now, in 1972, a coalition of 60 citizens groups in the United States challenged the Atomic Energy Commission on the safety of power reactors. And they got dozens and dozens of experts inside the Atomic Energy Commission to testify that they would not stand by the safety of these reactors. There is a critical device called the emergency core cooling system, which is necessary in case there is a sudden loss of cooling fluid. If the cooling fluid goes, the reactor core melts. And according to all expertise, it would melt through anything. In other words, there is no containment, stainless steel, concrete, or anything that will prevent this from melting right down into the ground. It's called the China syndrome, because it seems to head in the general direction of Asia. But when this happens, there is going to be an enormous release of radioactive gases and possible pollution, poisoning of groundwaters, water supplies, and so on. This accident is so horrendous that the people who manufacture and build the nuclear power plants just don't want to admit it as a possibility. Naturally, they take every possible precaution that it's not going to happen. My third point has to do with a rather grim issue, and it's the question of nuclear proliferation, proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because one of the reasons people are interested in nuclear reactors is that they produce material for atom bombs. Plutonium in particular. The Canadian reactor produces 3 times as much plutonium approximately as the equivalent American reactor. India, as you probably have read in your newspaper, set off its first atomic bomb explosion in May of this year with materials from a Canadian peaceful reactor. Canada is now trying to sell these reactors in South America and in South Korea. Can you imagine? In other words, they are giving them the wherewithal to produce plutonium to make bombs. Scientists most recently inside the Atomic Energy Commission, including a past Atomic Energy Commission commissioner, Larson, have readily admitted the fact that they are extremely worried of the possibility of some fanatic or criminal or terrorist group stealing plutonium and making a homemade atom bomb. It can easily be done, and Edward Teller himself is quoted, I don't know whether correctly or incorrectly, that there are thousands of people in the United States today who know how to make a homemade atom bomb. It's not a difficult thing to do. So, what I would urge is that
You'll get your chance to urge it in a moment, Dr. Edwards, but we must go back to Dr. Teller for rebuttal. 2 minutes for Edward Teller.
I agree with almost everything that Dr. Edwards said, and I have said it myself, with one exception. It is an exaggeration to say that wastes have to be cooled for 200 years. They have to be cooled for 2 years. They are so cooled, and the disposal is extremely safe. Accidents are more dangerous. And that is where indeed we have to make all possible precautions. And I have urged and am urging to put nuclear reactors 200 feet underground, and we know from hundreds of underground explosions that nuclear wastes don't travel underground and will not travel to China or anywhere else. Finally, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, a very serious question. Planes have been skyjacked. We are guarding a zillion planes. To guard reactors must be done and can be done. Proliferation has to go on if we want to prevent real shortage in energy. This is what we have to do. And I believe that the only hope is to do something against the causes of war. There will be always destructive weapons. Those weapons we won't stop. Causes we can stop if we provide people with the things they need.
Thank you, Dr. Teller. We're going to come back in a moment with a face-to-face and more informal discussion.
You are watching The Great Debate from Toronto's Yorkville Studio Theatre with Dr. Edward Teller taking the affirmative and Dr. Gordon Edwards taking the negative on our resolution that nuclear power plants are necessary and should be constructed. Pierre Berton is our chairman.
Just a word or two about our two debaters. Dr. Edward Teller scarcely needs an introduction. He was one of the key scientists who ushered in the atomic age, and he has been in that field almost consistently since then. He is Professor Emeritus at the Berkeley campus of the University of California. He was a one-time advisor to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, and his influence is still considered to be enormous in this field. He's talked about a shortage of energy. He has no shortage of energy himself. Dr. Gordon Edwards, Canadian. His field is mathematics. He's been a university lecturer, assistant director of mathematics study for the Science Council of this country. He edited the first 12 issues of Survival, the international ecology magazine, which has subscribers in a dozen countries. He describes himself as a scientifically educated layman on the subject of nuclear power plants. Right now, gentlemen, Dr. Teller, I wonder if we could get a little more detail on the business of radioactive garbage. There seems to be an argument here between you on how long it takes to cool it down. Dr. Edwards has said it's going to be 20,000 years before it ceases to be dangerous. You have said that doesn't matter because it doesn't move underground anyway. How about the 20,000 years? Is that figure accurate?
Yes and no. Radioactivity, as everybody knows, has a half-life. A radioactive substance loses half its power in a certain period. It loses a half of what has remained in the same period, and so on. Now, the radioactive garbage is composed of many substances. The most of the heat is in the short-lived garbage, which disappears within 2 years. What is likely to do the most damage if it gets loose are two substances. One of them is the famous strontium-90, which live approximately 30 years. To wait, let us say, 300 years until strontium-90 has decayed to 1/1000 of its original intensity is reasonable. Some substances, like plutonium, do live 20,000 years, and some 1,000,000 years. But these are very faintly radioactive, and therefore in themselves not as dangerous. The point is that we have to put them into places where they will not get around. There are several good ways to incorporate them, let us say, into rods, which are not unbreakable, but which will not pulverize if broken, and then put these rods into strong containers. If you break such a container, you have a nuisance, not a catastrophe. If a reactor goes wrong, you do have a catastrophe. And that is why I am trying to differentiate between these two types of danger. I try to be brief.
With regard to waste disposal, I would like to point out that plutonium is one of the most dangerous biomedical substances known to man. Over 50% of AEC, Atomic Energy Commission, research dollars is spent on the biomedical effects of plutonium. A tiny amount is enough to cause millions of human lung cancers with almost 100% certainty if distributed in a form where it can be inhaled. This could happen in a variety of ways. I would like to bring out...
Just a minute. Dr. Teller makes the point that you could put it all in rods, put the rods in containers, presumably bury them, and in his view, that makes it safe for the next...
Let me tell you a bit, Pierre, about the history of waste storage in the United States. In 1969, the United States General Accounting Office reported that there were 93 million gallons of high-level waste stored underground in 3 states. These are in stainless steel and concrete containers which have their own cooling systems, and they said that these things would have to be cooled and guarded for more than 600 years.
Dr. Teller, do you want to comment on that?
They also said that 18 of these tanks have been found to be defective within the last 25 years, and some 227,000 gallons of high-level waste have already escaped into the soil.
The most famous of these cases are the containers in Hanford, where the initial disposal happened in water. Our Reactor Safeguard Committee objected to that before 1950. Our fear was that in a really violent earthquake, there may be a spillage into the Columbia River, which would make the Columbia River not drinkable for a considerable period. I don't know whether it's days or weeks, but it would be a very serious case, although not as serious as the earthquake itself. What has escaped into the ground did escape, but we measured the rate at which it is diffusing through the ground. And it takes several thousand years to diffuse a mile. And the containers are quite a few miles from the Columbia River. What has escaped into the ground is much less dangerous than what has remained, because that now is not accessible. You can't get at it unless you go there and eat the dirt.
Well, I think the only thing that I'm interested in establishing at this point is the fact that there have been accidents, that things, according to the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, they figure that their waste have to be cooled, may have to be cooled for 200 to 300 years. Accordingly, these wastes had to be cooled for a much longer period of time. I would also mention that every scheme so far proposed that has stood the test of time for more than about, let's say, 10 years, has fallen flat on its face for disposal of these wastes. One of the most outstanding of these was $100 million and 15 years of research spent in a project called Salt Vault. It was going to be absolutely the answer. The Atomic Energy Commission, Alvin Weinberg, who's the director of the Oak Ridge Laboratory, went to the Congressional Committee, which is authorizing funds for these things, and requested $25 million to immediately start storing wastes in the Salt Vault. And he guaranteed that this was the best possible site. Immediately, the plan came under attack by Dr. Hamilton, who is director of the Kansas Geological Survey, and by many others. And they said that it is the assumptions they have not made which concern us. I'm quoting. They are talking about canisters which contain the waste, like such as your metal rods. But in a relatively short time, there will be no canisters because the ceramic matrix and the metal containment will have disintegrated under the influence of radiation. And it's a well-known property of radiation that it embrittles metal, and that in a relatively short time, this metal containment will be gone. Now, what he was afraid of was the fact that there might be water, possible seepage of water into that mine. And if that happened, you would have, even if this happened within a couple of 100 years, you would have a steam buildup, possible explosion, followed by a volcanic geyser of radioactive materials. spreading this radioactivity over a very, very wide, hundreds of square miles possibly. I don't know how far it would go when it was airborne.
We are discussing details which cannot be discussed completely here. By good luck, I happen to know about this detail. I have to say two things about this point. But I hope that we don't spend too much time in these details. One point is this. What my good friend Alvin Weinberg proposed is to store nuclear waste in salt domes, where there is geologic evidence that the salt dome had not been disturbed for 1 million years, and where the salt itself guarantees that no water can get to the interior. In principle, this would have been right. Unfortunately, the man in charge of safety at that time in the atomic energy was a man by the name of Milchaw, who, for neglecting safety, has been kicked out. Incidentally, after having been defended by quite a few congressmen. It was not an easy thing to do. And the AEC, under his initiative, tried to put the radioactivity not into a salt dome, which is solid, but into a shallow salt mine in Kansas, which satisfied none of the original conditions.
I would urge anybody...
Excuse me, please. This was a misapplication of the original idea. And the original idea, I believe, has very real merit if properly executed. Now I want to come to the second point. The danger of radioactivity. A few people, a couple of dozen, have been hurt in radioactive accidents, some killed. None of them in functioning reactors, some in experimental devices, including experimental reactors. There have been promulgated safety standards so strict that people now are scared of the amount of radioactivity that we and our ancestors have been receiving for the last few million years. This radiation scare has prevented people from getting proper treatment, have prevented people, even have made people doubtful whether they should get medical x-rays which exceed systematically these standards. And I believe that many more lives have been lost to the radiation scare than have been lost to the radiation. I don't deny that mistakes have been made. I don't believe that there is any foolproof method to do anything, because the fool is always greater than the proof. But I do believe that we cannot get what we need unless we take some reasonable chances. And what is a reasonable chance must, in the end, be decided by experts who are not always right, who should be criticized, who are criticized. Many of us, including me, have insisted that all this discussion should be open. After it has been opened, after the
Dr. Teller, do you mind if I open the discussion to
individuals,
Dr. Edwards for a moment?
I would like to take...
conceivably.
I would like to...
No, I've got a question for you, Dr. Edwards. Dr. Teller's major point tonight has been the subject of the energy crisis. Mm-hmm. He has said that the energy crisis can drive us into the kind of depression that destroys democracy and produces dictators, mm-hmm. and therefore, if you are measuring, as I understand him, the danger of nuclear radiation or nuclear accidents against that danger, he feels that danger is worse and that there is really no other answer but to go ahead with nuclear energy. What do you say to that?
I say that it's a very desperate move. Senator Howard Baker, for example, says there's a risk, it's probably the greatest risk that any civilization has ever taken. I don't think it's worth the risk. First of all, the energy crisis is a phony crisis. It was largely a refinery crisis in the United States, which could have been foreseen. The real way to tackle the energy crisis is to look at energy wastage. Energy has been doubling every 10 years. One of the reasons we have an energy crisis, I would say, is because of nuclear power, and I'm not the only one to say this, because the nuclear scientists have been telling us, promising us for decades that there's unlimited energy right around the corner. Therefore, don't skint. Don't just use all the energy you want. And as a result, we've had preferential rates for large users of energy. In the States, they use aluminum to make beer cans, which are used once and thrown away. Aluminum takes 7 times the energy to smelt. So instead of passing laws regulating planned obsolescence, regulating the throwaway society, regulating the use of energy-intensive materials when other materials could have been used instead, improving the insulation of homes, improving the efficiency of air conditioners, it has been shown in recent studies, one of them by the Science Council of Canada, that if they instituted conservation measures starting now, they could save as much energy between now and 1990 as nuclear energy would produce in that period of time.
Dr. Edwards, I'm going to interrupt you. I know both you gentlemen have a lot more to say, but I'm going to bring our audience into it because they have a lot to say too. We'll be back with our audience and our 2 debaters in a moment.
You are watching The Great Debate. From Toronto, our subject resolved that nuclear power plants are necessary and should be constructed. Our debaters, Dr. Edward Teller for the affirmative, Dr. Gordon Edwards for the negative, and our chairman, Pierre Berton.
And it's time to go to our audience. The gentleman in the front row has a question. Would you stand up, sir?
Dr. Teller, at the beginning of the program tonight, there was mention that the Americans, where you come from, do need nuclear reactors. But we Canadians have enough energy not to have need of it. Now, I'd like to ask you, both of you, to comment on that question.
Why do Canadians need nuclear reactors when they got lots of energy is the question, I think, Dr. Teller.
They don't. They have constructed what is, in my opinion, the world's best reactor, the CANDU reactor. Least dangerous. It has the great advantage that it can run with little uranium, won't deplete resources, can be run on natural uranium and on thorium. Your export of these reactors can help England, can help Europe, can help other countries. I wish the energy crisis were not real. America cannot be isolationist. Canada can be even less isolationist. And because you don't feel the pinch, the storm will get you.
Dr. Edwards, any comment before you
Yes, I'd like to comment, first of all, that by pushing the CANDU reactor, Canada is promising to export concentrated energy in the form of heavy water. They're going to supply all the heavy water. They've had trouble supplying their own reactors with heavy water. It takes an enormous amount of electricity to make heavy water that are used in the CANDU reactors, and nobody has ever taken that into account in terms of figuring out how much energy it actually produces. But in the States, as late as 1970, the Atomic Energy Commission of the Atomic Energy Commission of the United States was the largest user of energy. They consumed 10 times as much energy as all their atomic power plants consumed. The American military has been gobbling up huge heaps of energy. In their Vietnam War, they've just used incredible amounts of energy. Now they've got an energy crisis. My dear, we have to look out for the poor, underdeveloped countries and the poor people who can't heat their homes. They have the most wasteful society which has ever existed on the face of the earth. And I think this has become very dramatically clear in the last 10 or 20 years. And now they're talking about energy crisis and portraying it as if all we need is more energy. Just give us more energy. I say that energy consumption right now is not correlating with the quality of life. It's correlating with garbage, pollution, exhaustion of resources, and devastation.
Dr. Teller.
Again, Dr. Edwards is right, or more accurately, half right. We have produced too much garbage. We must save energy. It is true, we in the United States use 1/3 of the world's energy. But in 1950, we used almost 1/2. The energy increase was correlated with the re-establishment of good life in Europe, in Japan. In the future, it is connected with the development of the developing countries, which if it does not come, then we are lost. We must save, and we must also produce more energy. You in Canada, for others. We, partly for others, partly for ourselves. But one last point. That heavy water requires so much energy is quantitatively wrong. But there are new ways to produce heavy water more cheaply with lasers. And this is one of the most important research projects that I am urging on my colleagues, so that heavy water should not only be effective, but also cheap. And you need it for the CANDU reactor.
Right, let's go back to our audience. Gentleman up there. Would you stand, sir?
Some years ago, Dr. Teller, you were flying around over Carlsbad, New Mexico, and they were exploding an underground explosion, 2.7 kilotons. Way down under, it shouldn't have gotten out. As the explosion came through the surface, you said there are some surprises. Isn't it possible that there could be some surprises with your storage of nuclear wastes in salt mines?
Yes. Niels Bohr defined an expert as a man who, through his own painful experience, found out all the mistakes that one can commit in a very narrow field.
I would like to make...
I am not an expert. I haven't made all the mistakes. I have made most of the mistakes. And there are some things that are safer, some things that are less safe. To fiddle with the energy crisis is unsafe. To work with nuclear energy has become, as human endeavors go, quite safe.
Dr. Edwards?
First of all, I think the scientist in his laboratory for the last 300 years has become rather arrogant, because he's been working alone, taking all kinds of chances, exploring the unknown, always exposing himself to risk, always facing the possibility of blowing himself up in his lab with him. And I think that this is very deeply ingrained in the scientific mentality. Now they're using the world as their laboratory. They're trying the experiments on a very large scale indeed. 20,000 years. I was just over at the China exhibit and I saw some fantastic relics dating back 5,000 years. I wonder what people 5,000 years from now are going to think when all they can find are radioactive garbage dumps, which still have to be guarded, because if they ever get out...
Well, we made the point in radioactive garbage, I think, enough.
Okay,
we'll go back to our audience.
May I please say that this radioactive garbage has good users. And in 5,000 years, this radioactive garbage will be used safely and effectively, and it will not be called garbage.
All right, gentleman up there, would you stand, please?
Yes, Dr. Edwards, I'm sure we would all agree that fire has been a great boon to mankind. Yet in all the times that man has used this source of energy, we have not yet been able to guarantee a safeguard for all the homes that are burned each year by fire. The same thing with oil and natural gas. Very good resources to use for energizing our needs and our way of life, but yet these have not yet been able to be safely maintained and to be guaranteed that there would be no deaths or destruction caused on these sources of energy. Now I just wonder, if this debate were taking place back in history, if you would also be opposed to tapping these resources of energy as you are with the nuclear problem, which of course has risks involved, but the benefits, I think, far outweigh those risks.
Let me answer that since you posed it to me. I think that you're really trying to compare oranges and apples, because you just take a look at any of the leading geneticists who are knowledgeable about radiation. They're extremely concerned about the possibility of really retrogressive evolution of species. There's Polikarpov, for example, who wrote a book called Radioecology of Aquatic Organisms. Says further radioactive contamination of the oceans is intolerable. Levels which are far below the so-called safe levels that Dr. Teller referred to have caused abnormalities in fish embryos, and he says that these are in danger of undermining the whole ocean fisheries. Moreover, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist Joshua Lederberg predicted that if the population of the United States were exposed to what Dr. Teller referred to as a safe dose, that is, a maximum permissible dose of radiation, that the public health burden by the year 2000 would cost about $10 billion in genetically related diseases, not counting things like stillbirths and deformities, just counting things like schizophrenia, coronary heart disease, arteriosclerosis, all the diseases that have genetic linkages. There's also carcinogenic aspects. These are low levels of radiation. What we are talking about here is the survival of life on Earth. And I would like to read a quote, if I had it ready at hand, which I don't think I have.
Don't bother, Dr. Edwards. I think you've made your point. Dr. Teller has raised his hand.
Briefly.
The permitted radiation on the border of a reactor is 5 milliards per year. In Denver, Colorado, because the place is closer to the sky, the excess radiation, and for a few other reasons, the excess radiation is 100 milliards. I will not want to criticize reactors until the 20 times more dangerous location of Denver is evacuated.
Gentleman over here has a question. Would you stand up,
Can I rebut that?
No, man behind you. Man behind you, stand.
Dr. Teller, I wonder if you would comment along these same lines then on the studies that have been done in the United States on low-level radiation, which have indicated dramatic increases in leukemia rates, infant mortality rates, and infant defects around the nuclear reactor sites, particularly in Pennsylvania and Michigan.
May I please say that they have not? There is a lot of misinformation about that, and I can continue to talk about it for a long time. How many hours do I have, Mr. Chairman?
2 minutes.
In 2 minutes, I can do exceedingly little. But I can tell you that airplane hostesses are exposed to 4 times the maximum permissible dose, which in turn is very much greater than this 5 million. They are exposed to 600 million. And no statistics has yet shown that these airplane hostesses are worse off. In fact, in the United States, they have won a suit for the right to work under those conditions.
Dr. Teller, I'm afraid that you're really giving out misinformation here, and I think you know you are.
I am sure that this is not true.
That you are not giving out misinformation. Well, you accuse me.
That is not what I said. I said that if I'm giving out misinformation, I don't know that I am.
Okay, well, let me explain how you are, because you have just enunciated some of the principal myths which are associated with nuclear power. First of all, that standing at the boundary of a nuclear power plant is the way you get radiation from nuclear power. It is not. The main burden of radiation from a nuclear power plant is in the food chain, as you well know. It concentrates in the food chain.
How does it get there?
It gets there from routine emissions from every power plant.
It does not. The only routine emission is inert gas.
I must bring the argument to an end because we're coming to the end, and we want to give you a chance in a moment to sum up your arguments before our audience votes. We'll be back in a moment for that summing up. See you then. Right, 45 seconds here in the great debate for the affirmative and Dr. Edward Teller.
My honorable opponent has accused me in an extremely polite form of lying. In a scientific manner, I admit I have lied in my life, in one way or the other, but never in science. I have one more thing to say to you. Of all matter known to man, the human brain is the most inert. I want to make a rapid prediction. None of you will have changed your mind due to this little debate.
Well, we'll see. 45 seconds now for Dr. Gordon Edwards.
Yes, I think people won't be able to change their mind until they get facts, which they're not given. I think that what we should call for is a moratorium on the building of nuclear power plants, the setting up of an independent task force with citizen representation to look into the whole question of nuclear power plants in Canada. And I think there should be immediate research on the conservation of energy, immediate implementation of legislation. I think there should be immediate channeling of funds into alternative sources of energy which are relatively non-polluting and which can meet all our energy needs well beyond 2000, such as solar energy, which is proven, geothermal energy, gasification of coal, wind power. There are all kinds of things which the National Research Council are presently experimenting with, but they're starved for funds. The nuclear boys have it all.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. All right, it's time to vote. If you agree with Dr. Edward Teller, show him the green side of your cards. If you agree with Dr. Gordon Edwards, show him the red side of your cards. Cards up, please. We'll be back in a moment to tell you the results. See you then.
It's the Great Debate from Toronto, and here's Pierre Berton to bring you the results of the vote on tonight's resolution that nuclear power plants are necessary and should be constructed.
Right, when the program started, Dr. Teller had 76 on his side and Dr. Edwards 20 on his side, and I told you, Dr. Teller, that made it very difficult for you. It has proved to be so. Dr. Edwards now has 60 on his side. He has changed 40 minds. You still have 36. We declare the debate won by Dr. Gordon Edwards. Congratulations, sir.
Congratulations. The wrong side had won.
I hope to see you close about scientific lies.
Now, let me tell you just briefly about next week's program. Next week's program deals with Western separatism. Resolved that the West should separate from Canada. And taking the affirmative is a Western separatist, Queen's Counsel, former head of the Progressive Conservative Party in Alberta, Mr. Milt Herodance. Opposing Western separatism, or indeed any kind of separatism, is a Quebecer. Réal Cowett, the leader of the Federal Social Credit Party, will defend the Constitution. We hope you'll all be with us when, once again next week, we stage the Great Debate. See you then.
Tonight's subject was resolved that nuclear power plants are necessary and should be constructed. Our debaters were Dr. Edward Teller for the affirmative and Dr. Gordon Edwards for the negative. Guests on the Great Debate stay at the Hyatt Regency, Toronto's most exciting hotel. I'm Bernard Cowan. If you are in Toronto on a Thursday evening and would like tickets to the Great Debate, write to the Great Debate, Box 2200, Postal Station P, Toronto.